The bullwhip effect in supply chains. The bullwhip effect is an effect that occurs when distorted demand information is communicated from downstream stages of supply chain to upstream stages, and it usually leads to exaggerated order swings and big inefficiencies in supply chains. The way we can measure it is when we see that the consumer demand varies just not that much, and then we see that retail orders vary much more and wholesale orders vary even more. And as you go upstream, up the supply chain stages, you will discover there is more and more variability. Then there is a bullwhip effect. So it's similarly to the bullwhip. If you move it a little bit in your hand, the end of the bullwhip swings much more. We can observe the bullwhip effect in a lot of supply chains. And this is just one example where you have consumer sales, which are roughly steady, right? They vary a little bit, but they don't have a lot of variability. When you see then retail orders, those retailers that sell to consumers, when you see retail orders, there is more swings. Sometimes we have zero ordered in a unit of time, and sometimes much more. Right, there are peaks, and then you see that they get magnified when you see wholesaler ordering from manufacturing, and even more variability when manufacturer orders from supplier. So there's a lot of examples you can observe this, and we will discuss the causes and consequences of these. Of course, looking at charts is just trying to observe visually the bullwhip effect. However, we can also measure it quantitatively. We can calculate some measures of variability of demand at different stages of the supply chain, and then we can see through these measures that the variability is increasing. For example, we could calculate a standard deviation, or better yet, the coefficient of variation, and we could see what's the coefficient of variation at consumer sales compared to retail orders to wholesalers, wholesaler orders to manufacturers, and coefficient of variation of manufacturer orders to suppliers. And if there is a bullwhip effect, we could see a considerable increase of these coefficients of variations as we move up the supply chain. You can see the bullwhip effect actually on a much larger scale in the whole economy. Here is an example that shows us with the solid line, you see the GDP, gross domestic product of a country. And it is known that when GDP, there is a growth in GDP, this is percentage change, that growth usually means people get richer on average and they buy more cars. So you see, this is the auto sales increase or decrease. You see there is more swings in auto sales than there is in GDP increase. And then when you see machine tools, this is looking at the whole country, right? The sales of machine tools, the swings are even larger in terms of increase to decrease. So you see again here, this is not just looking at one supply chain of a particular product, but relationships between the wealth of the country with the purchases of the cars, and how those purchases of the cars affect the purchases of machine tools that are in turn used to assemble those cars, right? So you see there's more and more variability. There are many negative consequences of the bullwhip effect, and these, of course, lead to increase in costs and inefficiencies in the supply chain. So the first one is excessive inventory. If the demand for a certain stage in the supply chain has higher variability than necessary, then that means bigger safety stock has to be allocated in order to protect from stockouts. But also, there could be situations where we predict a very high demand, and the demand turns out to be very small for a very long time, and then we have a lot of unnecessary inventory that we booked, that we ordered or purchased from a higher stage in the supply chain. Product forecasting will suffer because if you try to forecast demand, let's say if you're a distributor and you look at retailer orders, you might actually see much more variability in the orders than there is really in consumer sales. And then, therefore, you might have much more uncertainty in your forecast. If at the manufacturing level, the capacities might be at one point insufficient and another point might be excessive, because if the order on one time is very high, you might have shortage of capacity, and in another time point, you might have a lot of idle capacity because the orders suddenly decreased significantly. Customer service can suffer due to the above, right? You might have unavailable products, or sometimes you might have long back orders. Production planning becomes very difficult and then requires some revisions, which are not something that we would like to have, and it might be very expensive. If we planned for much lower demand, costs of correction might be very high if we have to send, for example, expedited shipments, or we have to hire people for overtime. Generally, transportation costs will also be higher, and overall allocation of resources will be inefficient throughout the supply chain.